Stalingrad, September 1942. The sky over the Volga burns red with fire and smoke. The Battle of Stalingrad has transformed the industrial city into a landscape of hell. German Stukas scream overhead while Soviet fighters climb desperately to meet them. Anti-aircraft guns bark from positions that change hourly as the front lines shift like sand and wind. The air smells of cordite, burning oil, and death. Among the Soviet pilots flying against impossible odds is Captain Nikolai Sergeyevich Morozov, a fighter ace with the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment. He isn't the most famous pilot in the regiment. Men like Lydia Litviak and Ivan Kozydub would claim that distinction, but among his fellow flyers he's known as reliable, skilled, and impossibly lucky. 37 confirmed kills. 51 combat missions over Stalingrad alone. Not a scratch on him. Morozov flies a Yakovlev Yak-1, a sleek fighter painted in winter camouflage that's already fading from the heat and violence of summer combat. His aircraft bears no markings except the red star and a tactical number painted hastily on the fuselage. He doesn't name his plane or paint kill marks on the side. He treats it as a tool, maintaining it with meticulous care, checking every rivet before every flight, speaking quietly to the mechanics about fuel mixtures and ammunition loads. Other pilots talk about him with a mixture of respect and unease. He's competent, even brilliant in combat, but he keeps himself separate. He doesn't join in the drinking sessions after missions. He doesn't tell stories or make jokes. He sits alone in the corner of the pilot's barracks, writing in a small leather journal that he keeps in his flight suit, never letting anyone read what he writes there. Intelligence files later declassified from Soviet archives mention Morozov in fragments. He'd been a test pilot before the war, flying experimental aircraft out of a facility near Moscow. He'd been transferred to combat duty in early 1942, though the reasons for the transfer were redacted. His performance evaluations were excellent. His political reliability was rated as satisfactory, which in NKVD language meant someone was watching him. And then, on September 23, 1942, during a massive air battle over the burning city, Captain Nikolai Morozov vanished. His squadron encountered a formation of German bombers escorted by Messerschmitt fighters. The engagement was chaotic, violent, the kind of whirling dogfight where friend and enemy became impossible to distinguish in the smoke and confusion. Radio transmissions captured fragments of voices, call signs, warnings, desperate last words. One transmission, believed to be Morozov's voice, said simply, "Engine hit, braking east. I'll try to make it back." That was the last anyone heard from him. No crash site was found, no wreckage reported, no body recovered. The 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment listed Captain Nikolai Sergeyevich Morozov as missing in action, presumed killed. His personal effects were packed and sent to a widow in Leningrad. His name was added to a memorial wall. His seat in the barracks was given to a replacement pilot who lasted 3 days before being shot down over the Volga. For decades, Morozov would be just another name on the long list of Soviet pilots who disappeared in the skies over Stalingrad. Another ghost in a battle that consumed thousands. But aviation historians and crash site investigators never quite forgot him, because of what Morozov had been carrying that day. Something that wasn't on any official manifest. Something that still hasn't been fully explained. September 23, 1942. The last flight. The mission briefing had been rushed, assembled with the desperate urgency that characterized everything at Stalingrad in those months. German bombers were targeting Soviet positions on the western bank of the Volga. Morozov's squadron, already down to 7 operational aircraft from an authorized strength of 12, was to intercept and destroy them. According to surviving mission logs recovered from Russian military archives in 1998, Morozov's squadron took off from their forward airfield at 14:47 hours. Weather conditions were poor, smoke from the burning city reducing visibility to less than 2 kilometers at ground level. The formation climbed through the murk, their engines straining in the hot, polluted air. Contact with the enemy came at 15:03 hours, approximately 30 kilometers southwest of Stalingrad, a formation of Heinkel. E-111 bombers, 9 aircraft, escorted by at least a dozen Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. The Soviet pilots, outnumbered nearly 2-1, attacked anyway. They had no choice. Those bombers were targeting the tractor factory, where Soviet workers were still assembling tanks even as artillery shells landed in the streets outside. The radio logs from that engagement, partially preserved and partially reconstructed from German intercepts, paint a picture of absolute chaos. Multiple aircraft engaged in simultaneous combat, overlapping transmissions, voices shouting warnings, coordinates, prayers. At 15:17 hours, Morozov's wingman, Lieutenant Vasily Petrov, transmitted, "Raven 3 is hit. Smoke from engine. He's turning east, losing altitude." Raven 3 was Morozov's call sign. Another pilot reported seeing a Yak-1 streaming white smoke, possibly coolant, descending in a controlled glide toward the east. But in the chaos of combat, with German fighters still pressing the attack, no one could break off to follow or provide escort. The standing orders were clear: complete the mission first, worry about downed pilots later. The Soviet formation continued the engagement for another 8 minutes, claiming 3 Heinkel bombers destroyed and damaging several others before breaking off. When they returned to base, 1 pilot didn't land: Morozov. Search and rescue operations were launched the following day, once the immediate tactical situation stabilized enough to spare resources. Soviet ground forces in the area were questioned. No one reported seeing an aircraft crash. No smoke columns had been observed in the sectors where Morozov should have come down. German intelligence reports, captured after the war, made no mention of a downed Soviet fighter in that area on that date. If Morozov had crashed in German-controlled territory, there should have been some record, even if just a brief notation in a daily intelligence summary. There was nothing. The official investigation concluded that Morozov had likely crashed in one of the many ravines or gullies that cut through the steppe east of Stalingrad, his aircraft hidden by terrain or quickly covered by blowing dust. With the battle still raging and resources stretched impossibly thin, a more extensive search was impossible. The case was closed. Morozov was declared dead. His widow never accepted it. Irina Morozova wrote letters to military authorities for years, requesting more information, asking for his body to be found so she could bury him properly. She received polite but firm responses. The matter was closed. Resources could not be spared. Many thousands had died at Stalingrad. Not every body could be found. She should be proud her husband had served the motherland with distinction. She died in 1987, still not knowing what had happened to Nikolai, still waiting for him to come home. And yet, rumors persisted among the pilots who survived Stalingrad, who flew with Morozov, who knew him as well as anyone knew that quiet, solitary man. Rumors that he hadn't been flying a normal combat mission, that he'd been carrying something, that his disappearance might not have been what it seemed. Because Nikolai Morozov wasn't just a fighter pilot, he'd been a test pilot. And test pilots, especially in Stalin's Soviet Union, sometimes flew missions that had nothing to do with combat. The Volga Steppe, 1942 to 2010. For those who lived in the vast emptiness east of Stalingrad, the war was something that happened elsewhere. A distant thunder that occasionally became frighteningly close when aircraft roared overhead or when refugees appeared on the roads, fleeing the apocalypse in the west. The steppe is an ocean of grass and dust, broken by deep ravines carved by ancient rivers, dotted with small villages that seem impossibly isolated, connected by dirt roads that become impassable mud in spring and choking dust in summer. It's a landscape that swallows things. Vehicles break down and are abandoned, slowly disappearing under blowing soil. Buildings collapse and are reclaimed by the earth. People die in the emptiness and their bones are scattered by animals and wind. In the years immediately following the battle, the steppe was littered with debris of war: shell casings, shrapnel, wrecked vehicles, unexploded ordnance that killed children who found it while playing, and aircraft wreckage, pieces of aluminum and steel that had fallen from the sky during those desperate months. Most of it was eventually collected, salvaged for scrap metal in the desperate reconstruction years, but not all of it. The steppe is too vast. Some things remained hidden. In villages like Tinguta, Kotelnikovo, and Jutovo, people occasionally spoke of finding aircraft parts while plowing fields or herding cattle, fragments of wing, sections of fuselage marked with faded red stars, engine cowlings crushed by impact. Local museums collected some of these artifacts, displaying them as reminders of the battle, but most were simply noted and ignored. There were more pressing concerns than cataloging every piece of war debris. But there was one area, a section of steppe approximately 40 kilometers east of where Stalingrad had stood, that collected more stories than most. A depression in the landscape, not quite a ravine, but deeper than a simple valley, where the soil was different, softer, darker, and where things seemed to sink more quickly than elsewhere. Locals called it Mrtvaya Dolina, Dead Valley. The name had existed before the war, something to do with a cholera outbreak in the 19th century, but after 1942 it took on new meaning. Herders avoided it, farmers plowed around it, children were warned to stay away, though whether from superstition or the very real danger of unexploded ordnance was unclear. Occasionally, people reported strange things, a metallic gleam visible after heavy rains, something buried just below the surface before being covered again by shifting soil, sounds that seemed to come from underground, though whether from wind through hidden caves or settling debris or imagination was impossible to say. One persistent account came from a farmer named Pyotr Volkov, who, in the spring of 1958, claimed his tractor had broken through a crust of soil and nearly fell into a hidden cavity. He said he looked down into the darkness and saw metal, shaped metal, not natural rock. He reported it to local authorities, but when they investigated days later, the hole had collapsed or filled in. They found nothing. Another story involved children in the 1970s who claimed they'd found an entrance to an underground space like a cave but with smooth walls. They said they'd seen red paint inside and wires and something that looked like a chair. Adults dismissed it as fantasy, games children play, but one father went to look and found only disturbed soil, nothing more. Whether truth or legend, whether actual observations or stories that had grown in the telling, one thing was consistent. Something was buried in Dead Valley, something large, something that had been there since the war, and that something, though no one in the villages could have known it, was the aircraft and body of Captain Nikolai Sergeyevich Morozov, the man who had vanished on his last mission, the pilot who had never returned home. The 1990s to 2020s, the search for history. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought many changes, including a surge of interest in recovering and documenting World War II history that had been suppressed or ignored for decades. Aviation archaeologists, both Russian and international, began systematic searches for missing aircraft, using a combination of archival research, eyewitness testimonies, and increasingly sophisticated technology. The Stalingrad battlefield became a focus for these efforts. Hundreds of aircraft had been shot down during the battle, both Soviet and German, and most were still out there, buried in the steppe, waiting to be found. Each crash site was a time capsule, containing not just aircraft components but often human remains, personal effects, evidence of lives interrupted by violent death. In 1997, a British aviation archaeologist named David Richardson published a comprehensive study of missing aircraft from the Stalingrad battle. Morozov's case caught his attention. Unlike most missing pilots whose loss was documented with multiple witness reports and clear evidence of combat damage, Morozov had simply vanished. One moment he was in combat, the next he was gone, with only fragmentary radio transmissions to mark his passing. Richardson attempted to triangulate Morozov's likely flight path based on his last known position, his reported heading, the damage his aircraft had sustained, and estimated fuel remaining. The calculations suggested he would have come down in a specific sector of steppe east of Stalingrad, an area approximately 15 kilometers square. Richardson organized an expedition in 1999, bringing ground-penetrating radar and metal detectors, searching methodically through the calculated zone. They found aircraft debris, identified as parts of a German Junkers Ju-88 bomber, but nothing that matched a Yak-1 fighter. Other researchers tried over the years. A Russian television documentary team in 2004, a group of aviation enthusiasts from Moscow in 2011. Each expedition found something: shell casings, vehicle parts, personal items from soldiers, but never Morozov's aircraft. The search was complicated by the terrain. The steppe might look flat and featureless, but it's actually riddled with erosion channels and depressions that can hide surprisingly large objects. Soil composition varies, affecting how things sink and how deeply they're buried. And after 60, 70, 80 years, natural processes have covered evidence with meters of accumulated sediment. In 2015, a Russian researcher named Dmitry Kovalev became obsessed with Morozov's case. Unlike earlier researchers who focused on the combat narrative, Kovalev examined Morozov's background. Test pilot, transferred to combat duty under unclear circumstances, known for being secretive. And there were hints in fragmentary documents that Morozov might have been involved in testing experimental equipment, new radio systems, maybe even early radar technology. Kovalev theorized that Morozov's last flight hadn't been a normal combat mission, that he'd been testing something, carrying something, and that his disappearance might have been more than simple mechanical failure. But his research was dismissed as conspiracy theory by mainstream historians. There was no concrete evidence, just speculation and coincidence. Over time, most researchers moved on to other cases. Morozov became one of those perennial mysteries, interesting, but probably unsolvable. The steppe had swallowed him, and the steppe was vast and patient and kept its secrets well, until climate change and severe weather patterns began reshaping the landscape itself, until a once-in-a-century storm did what decades of searching could not, until the Earth itself decided to give up what it had been hiding. June 2023. The storm. Climate change has brought increasingly severe weather to southern Russia. Droughts that last for months followed by violent storms that dump a year's worth of rain in a few days. The steppe, with its thin topsoil and limited vegetation, is especially vulnerable to these extremes. Erosion that would normally take decades happens in hours. In late June 2023, a massive storm system stalled over the Volga region. For 3 days, rain fell in sheets, turning the steppe into a temporary lake. Overwhelming drainage systems washing away roads, collapsing buildings weakened by decades of neglect. When the storm finally passed and the water began to recede, the landscape had been transformed. New gullies had been carved. Old depressions had become deeper. Soil that had been stable for decades had been stripped away, revealing what lay beneath. A local farmer named Alexander Sokolov was surveying damage to his land, walking through areas he'd plowed for 30 years, when he noticed something strange in Dead Valley. The depression, which had always been lower than the surrounding steppe, had been scoured by the storm. Water had pooled there, then drained through new channels, carrying away meters of accumulated soil. And in the center of the depression, previously hidden, now partially exposed, was metal, painted metal, gray-green with traces of red, unmistakably military, unmistakably aircraft. Sokolov took photographs with his mobile phone and reported the discovery to authorities in Volgograd, the city that had been Stalingrad. Within 48 hours, a team from the Russian Ministry of Defense had arrived to assess the site. Within a week, a full excavation team was assembled. What they found wasn't just wreckage scattered across the surface, the typical pattern of an aircraft that had crashed and disintegrated. This was different. The aircraft was largely intact and buried nearly 5 meters below the current ground level, as if the Earth had swallowed it whole. Preliminary assessment identified it as a Yakovlev Yak-1, a Soviet fighter common during the Stalingrad battle. But this one was special. It was too complete, too well preserved. And as the excavation continued, carefully removing soil while monitoring for structural stability and unexploded ammunition, the mystery deepened. The aircraft hadn't crashed in the conventional sense. It had been landed, or more accurately, it had made a wheels-up emergency landing on soft ground, and then the soft ground had slowly engulfed it, pulling it down over years and decades until it disappeared completely beneath the surface. And inside the cockpit, still strapped into the pilot seat, preserved by the anaerobic conditions of deep burial, was a body. The excavation took 6 weeks, working carefully to preserve as much evidence as possible, to document everything before disturbing it, to treat this not just as an archaeological site, but as a war grave deserving of respect. And as the aircraft was slowly revealed, as the soil was brushed away from every surface, as markings became visible and serial numbers were recorded, the identity became certain. This was Yak-1 number 3457, the aircraft that had been assigned to Captain Nikolai Sergeyevich Morozov on September 23, 1942. The fighter that had vanished without a trace 81 years ago. The man who never returned had been found, but the mystery of what had happened to him, why his aircraft was buried so deeply, and what he'd been doing in this remote location so far from the battle, was only beginning to unfold. The aircraft, a time capsule. The excavation of Morozov's aircraft was a painstaking process that required months of careful work. Every component had to be documented in place before being removed. Every piece of fabric, every scrap of paper, Every fragment of equipment was photographed, catalogued, and preserved using techniques developed for maritime archaeology and adapted for this unique situation. What emerged was extraordinary. The aircraft was approximately 70% intact, an unprecedented level of preservation for a World War II fighter. The fuselage was damaged, but structurally complete. The engine showed clear evidence of battle damage, multiple hits from machine gun fire that had severed coolant lines and caused catastrophic overheating. But the wings were largely intact. The tail section showed minor damage. The landing gear, retracted at the time of the emergency landing, was still functional. The cockpit was the most remarkable preservation. The canopy had been shattered, probably during the emergency landing, but the interior had been sealed by the collapsing soil, creating an environment with minimal oxygen that had prevented normal decomposition processes. Instruments were still readable. The control stick still moved. The seat showed the wear patterns of regular use. And strapped into that seat, held in place by a harness that had remained intact for 81 years, was the body of the pilot. Mummified by the unique burial conditions, the figure was remarkably preserved. The flight suit was recognizable, leather with fur lining, Soviet military issue from 1942. The boots were still laced. Around the neck was a silk scarf, a common accessory among pilots of that era, both for practical warmth and as a symbol of their profession. And on the chest, in a leather pouch designed to be waterproof, was the pilot's documentation, a military identification book. The cover was water-stained, but the internal pages, protected by the leather case, were legible. Photograph of a serious-faced man with dark eyes, name printed in bureaucratic typeface, Captain Nikolai Sergeyevich Morozov, blood type O positive, service number 473891. After 81 years, the pilot who never returned had been identified. But forensic examination of the remains raised more questions than it answered. There were no signs of combat trauma, no bullet wounds, no shrapnel damage, no evidence of the violent death typically associated with shot-down aircraft. The skeleton showed fractures consistent with a hard landing, compressed vertebrae, broken ribs, but these were survivable injuries, painful but not immediately fatal. Toxicology analysis of preserved tissue samples revealed traces of carbon monoxide, suggesting he'd been breathing smoke from the damaged engine during his descent, but the levels weren't high enough to indicate he'd lost consciousness. The inescapable conclusion was that Nikolai Morozov had survived the emergency landing. He'd brought his damaged aircraft down in this remote location, executed a successful wheels-up landing on soft ground, and survived the impact. And then he'd died anyway. But how? And why hadn't he tried to walk out? It was 40 kilometers to the nearest Soviet positions, a difficult journey but not impossible for a healthy man. Why had he stayed with his aircraft? Why hadn't he activated his emergency locator beacon? The answers lay not in the body but in what surrounded it, in the equipment that shouldn't have been in a standard fighter aircraft, in the documents found sealed in waterproof containers, in the small leather journal discovered beneath the pilot's seat, in the secret that Nikolai Morozov had been carrying on his last flight, the secret cargo, Operation Zerkalo. Among the items carefully excavated from the aircraft's cockpit was equipment that didn't belong in a standard Yak-1 fighter. Behind the pilot's seat, in a space normally used for survival gear, investigators found a metal box approximately 40 centimeters square, secured with steel brackets and sealed with military tape. The box was marked with stenciled Cyrillic letters, Sekretno osoboj ważności, secret of special importance, the highest classification level in Soviet military terminology, reserved for materials that could affect national security. When the box was carefully opened in a controlled laboratory environment at the Central Museum of the Russian Armed Forces in Moscow, what they found inside changed everything. Documents, dozens of them, technical specifications, test reports, diagrams of electronic equipment, all stamped with the highest security classifications, and a sealed envelope bearing the personal seal of the Chief Directorate of the Air Force. The documents detailed a program codenamed Operation Zerkalo, Mirror. It was a crash program to develop airborne radar systems for Soviet fighters, inspired by intelligence reports that British and German aircraft were already using such technology. The Soviets were desperately trying to catch up, to give their pilots the ability to detect enemy aircraft at night or through clouds, to turn the tide of the air war. Captain Nikolai Morozov had been one of the test pilots for this program. His transfer from test flying to combat duty hadn't been a standard reassignment. It had been a cover. He'd continued his test pilot work while ostensibly flying combat missions, using the chaos of Stalingrad to conduct real-world testing of prototype equipment under operational conditions. The documents indicated that on September 23, 1942, Morozov had been flying with a prototype radar receiver installed in his aircraft. The mission had two objectives: engage enemy aircraft as normal, and test whether the radar system could detect them before visual contact. The technology was primitive, heavy, unreliable, but it represented a crucial step toward the sophisticated systems that would define air combat in later years. But something had gone wrong. Battle damage had compromised the aircraft's electrical system. The radar equipment had caught fire, filling the cockpit with toxic smoke. Morozov had been forced to break off and attempt an emergency landing, while simultaneously trying to prevent the classified equipment from falling into German hands. A letter found in the sealed envelope, signed by the Chief of Air Force Intelligence, outlined Morozov's orders in case of emergency. If the aircraft was damaged beyond recovery, he was to destroy the radar equipment and all associated documentation. Under no circumstances was the technology to be captured by the enemy. The letter emphasized, this equipment represents the future of aerial warfare. Its loss to enemy hands would be catastrophic. Protect it with your life. And that's exactly what Morozov had done. Among the items in the cockpit was evidence that he'd attempted to destroy the radar equipment after the crash landing. Burn marks on metal components, chemical residue from incendiary devices. But the fire hadn't been completely successful. Some components remained intact, still recognizable, still potentially exploitable if found by German search parties that might investigate the crash. Also found in the cockpit was Morozov's personal journal, the small leather-bound notebook that fellow pilots remembered him writing in. The final entries, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, told the rest of the story. The final hours, September 23rd, 24th, 1942. The journal was damaged by water and time, but much of it was legible, especially the final pages which had been protected by their position deep in the journal's binding. The last entries were dated September 23rd and 24th, 1942. September 23rd, approximately 16 hours, estimated from context, made emergency landing in ravine approximately 40 kilometers east of Stalingrad. Aircraft severely damaged but structurally intact. Engine destroyed by combat damage. Left leg injured, possibly broken in landing. More seriously, inhaled significant amount of smoke from electrical fire. Breathing is difficult. Coughing blood. Attempted to destroy radar equipment per operational protocols. Incendiary charges failed to completely consume the system. Some components remain intact. Cannot allow this to fall into enemy hands. Germans patrol this area regularly. Discovery is likely. Situation assessment. Cannot walk out with leg injury. No working radio electrical system destroyed. Emergency locator beacon was damaged in landing. No way to signal position to Soviet forces. Must wait for recovery team, but how will they find me? Decision. Will remain with aircraft. Will protect equipment. If Germans discover me, will destroy remaining components and documentation with my sidearm. Final option. Destroy myself as well. The motherland's secrets must be protected. The writing here is relatively steady. The script of a trained officer making tactical assessments despite pain and fear. September 23rd. Evening. Time unknown. Ground is soft. Aircraft is sinking. Did not realize when I landed. The soil here is different, saturated, unstable. The weight of the aircraft is causing it to slowly settle into the earth. Within hours, the fuselage has sunk several centimeters. At this rate, it will be partially buried by morning. This is actually advantageous. Natural concealment. Germans will not spot it from the air. May avoid ground patrols as well, but also means rescue will be more difficult. And if I am unable to free myself, breathing worse, coughing more blood. Lung damage from smoke inhalation is severe. I know the symptoms. I have seen it before in crash survivors who seemed fine initially but died within days from pulmonary edema. Have morphine and medical kit. Am rationing it. Pain is manageable for now, but I know it will get worse. September 24th morning. Night was difficult. Cold. Pain in leg and chest intense. Aircraft has sunk another 20 centimeters. The cockpit is now below the level of the surrounding ground. Can see only sky from here. Enclosed. Trapped. Heard aircraft overhead twice during night. Could not tell if Soviet or German. Could not signal either way. Emergency flares were lost when canopy shattered. Breathing continues to deteriorate. Blood and mucus is dark. Internal bleeding. Classical presentation of severe lung contusion. Without medical treatment, prognosis is poor, but no treatment is coming. I am 40 kilometers from Soviet lines. No one knows I am here. Tried again to destroy remaining radar components. No strength. Cannot move well enough to reach them. Hands shaking. Vision blurring. This is acceptable. Death was always likely in this war. Most of my academy classmates are already dead. I have survived longer than most. 37 confirmed victories. 51 combat missions. This is a better death than many. Not burning alive. Not drowning in the Volga. Just fading. To whoever finds this, the equipment in this aircraft is classified secret of special importance. It must be recovered and protected. Do not allow it to fall into unauthorized hands. The documentation in the sealed container explains everything. Tell my wife Irina that I died quickly. Do not tell her I suffered. Do not tell her I was alone. Tell her I was thinking of her at the end. This is true. I am thinking of her now. Of our apartment in Leningrad. Of her smile. Of the life we should have had. September 24th, afternoon or evening. Time estimate based on deteriorating handwriting. Aircraft nearly completely buried now. Only the vertical stabilizer remains above ground level. Inside the cockpit is dark, like being in a coffin. I suppose that is appropriate. This is my coffin. Cannot breathe well. Each breath is effort. Drowning in my own blood. Morphine keeping pain manageable but consciousness fading in and out. Have written letters to Irina. Sealed them in waterproof case with my identification documents. Hope they reach her. Hope she understands. Hope she remarries. She should not waste her life mourning me. Strange sensation. The aircraft settling into Earth. Can feel it slowly sinking. Like ship going down. But so slow. So gradual. Meters per hour instead of meters per second. Will be completely buried by tomorrow. Will disappear. Like I was never here. This is acceptable. Have done my duty. Protected the equipment. Followed orders. A good Soviet officer. A good communist. A good pilot. The final entry. Barely legible. Just a few words. Irina, I'm sorry. I tried to come home. After that, nothing. The journal ended there. Based on the forensic evidence, Morozov likely died within hours of that final entry, sometime on September 24th or early on September 25th, 1942. His aircraft continued sinking into the saturated soil, slowly disappearing beneath the surface over the following days and weeks until no trace remained visible above ground. He had protected his secret. The radar equipment and documentation had not fallen into German hands, but the cost had been his life, spent alone in the darkness of his buried cockpit, slowly suffocating on his own blood, waiting for a rescue that never came. The aftermath, memory and legacy. The discovery of Morozov's aircraft created headlines across Russia and internationally. The story had everything: wartime heroism, technological secrets, a pilot's sacrifice, and the dramatic revelation after 81 years of mystery. Forensic confirmation of Morozov's identity came through DNA comparison. His great-nephew, living in modern-day St. Petersburg, provided a sample that matched genetic material recovered from the remains. 99.7% certainty. The man in the cockpit was definitely Captain Nikolai Sergeyevich Morozov. The remains were returned to his family with full military honors. A ceremony attended by hundreds, by government officials and military officers, by aviation historians and members of veterans organizations. He was buried in Moscow's Troyekurovskoye Cemetery, in the section reserved for heroes of the Soviet Union, though he'd never received that official designation during his lifetime. The aircraft itself became the centerpiece of a new exhibit at the Central Museum of the Russian Armed Forces, a testament to the technological race that had occurred during World War II, and to the pilots who had risked everything to give the Soviet Union an advantage. But the most significant discovery was the radar equipment and documentation. Military historians had known that the Soviets had worked on airborne radar during the war, but the details of these early programs had been lost, destroyed or so heavily classified that even after the Soviet collapse they remained inaccessible. Morozov's aircraft provided unprecedented insight into these early efforts. The equipment, though primitive by modern standards, showed sophisticated thinking about radio wave propagation, antenna design, and signal processing. It helped explain how Soviet air defense radar systems had evolved in the post-war period, filling gaps in the historical record. The journals and letters were published, becoming bestsellers in Russia. People were moved by Morozov's final hours, by his dedication to duty, by his thoughts of his wife as he died alone in the darkness. He became a symbol of the countless soldiers who had died in obscurity, whose sacrifices had gone unrecognized, whose families had lived with uncertainty rather than closure. For aviation historians, the discovery solved one of the persistent mysteries of the Stalingrad air battle. For families of missing pilots, it offered hope that their own loved ones might someday be found and properly honored. But perhaps the most poignant aspect was the simplest. The letters Morozov had written to his wife in his final hours were delivered to his great-nephew, the only surviving family member who had known anything of Morozov's existence. They were personal, private, and devastating in their honesty. One letter, dated September 24, 1942, read in part, "My dearest Irina, if you are reading this, then I did not return from the war. I am sorry. I tried. I always intended to come home to you, to our life together, to the future we planned. But war does not care about intentions or plans or love. Do not mourn me too long. You are young. You have your whole life ahead. Find someone else. Be happy. Have the children we talked about. Name one Nikolai if you wish, but do not let my memory become a burden that prevents you from living. I died doing my duty. That is something. In a war where millions die meaninglessly, I at least died protecting something important. The equipment I was testing may help win this war, may save Soviet lives in the future. That gives my death purpose. But mostly I died thinking of you, of your smile, of your laugh, of the way you looked on our wedding day. These are my final thoughts. Not of war or duty or the motherland. Just you. Always you. I love you. I will always love you. If there is anything after death, any continuation of consciousness, then I will wait for you there. Until then, live. Live fully. Live for both of us." Your Nikolai, Irina Morozova, had died in 1987, never knowing what happened to her husband, never receiving his final letters, waiting 45 years for news that never came. That might be the real tragedy. Not that Morozov died. Soldiers die in war. But that his wife lived and died without knowing, without closure, without the goodbye he tried so hard to give her. The earth remembers. The steppe is quiet now where Morozov's aircraft was buried. The excavation site has been filled in, returned to agricultural use. Nothing marks the spot where he died except coordinates in archaeological databases. The earth has closed over the wound, as it always does. But in museums and archives, in published journals and documentary films, the story persists. Captain Nikolai Sergeyevich Morozov, the pilot who never returned, who died alone protecting secrets that might have changed the course of the war, who thought of his wife with his dying breath. He flew one last mission on September 23, 1942. He was 28 years old. He had a wife waiting in Leningrad. He had a future that was stolen by war and duty and bad luck. He crashed in a remote location and slowly sank into the earth, disappearing so completely that for 81 years it was as if he had never existed. But the earth remembered. The soil that swallowed him also preserved him. The steppe that hid him eventually revealed him. And now we remember too. His sacrifice was real. His death had purpose. His letters reached their destination, 8 decades late but finally delivered. His story, lost for so long, is now part of history, part of the record of what people endured and what they gave up in that terrible war. The snow falls softly over Moscow where he is buried. The grass grows tall over the steppe where he died. The wind blows across the Volga where he fought. And in all these places, memory persists. He never returned, but he was not forgotten. And in the end, perhaps that is enough.